Hey, just before we start, this video was written before Blue Origin blew up their launch pad while static firing in preparation for their fourth New Glenn launch, and there is no way I'm rewriting and re-recording the whole thing. So let's get started.
Hello everyone, Ultimate Steve here, and I'm really sorry. I did not intend for this to be a debunking channel, but there's one person in particular that has really gotten on my nerves recently, and I feel like I should at least try to do something to stop the spread of misinformation. Space launch is a complicated field to explain. It is quite literally rocket science. The general public doesn't know much about it, and as such, it is very easy for a journalist to either misunderstand something and report false information to an audience, or willfully misrepresent the facts to purposely mislead an audience. I believe that Will Lockett, the subject of this video, is guilty of both. This wouldn't normally be a problem, people are wrong on the internet all of the time, but I've seen an uptick in people unironically sharing Will's articles without realizing how bad they are. As someone who has a degree in aerospace engineering, a few thousand hours in Kerbal Space Program, and a job in the aerospace industry, I feel that I am somewhat qualified to evaluate the quality of articles focused on space launch. In this video, I'm going to take what is, as of the time of writing, his most recent space-related article and go through it with a fine-tooth comb to see how accurately it represents the facts. This article was released in December of 2025, and I dragged my feet a lot on writing this. I wasn't sure if I wanted to finish it, so that's why it's been about half of a year since then. Since then, he's obviously published a lot more space-related articles, and maybe I'll go over those sometime. This article, titled Blue Origin Might Make Starship Obsolete, is about comparing two rockets, Blue Origin's New Glenn and SpaceX's Starship, in terms of how cost-effectively they can deliver payload to the lunar surface. I will briefly give an overview of these two vehicles for the uninitiated. SpaceX's Starship is an ambitious, fully reusable super heavy launch vehicle designed to be capable of refueling in low Earth orbit and landing on other worlds, which will enable it to send heavy payloads to the Moon, Mars, and beyond. It has drawn attention for its rather extreme, iterative approach to development, preferring to rapidly produce prototypes and learn through repeated failure, rather than taking a long time to get it right on the first try. At the time of writing, several dozen prototypes have been produced, first stage reuse has been accomplished, and they are working on second stage reuse. Starship has yet to deliver a payload to orbit, but the focus of the program is getting to full reuse first and not getting to payload customer delivery first. Blue Origin's New Glenn is a somewhat less ambitious but still quite ambitious, partially reusable heavy launch vehicle designed to launch large payloads to various destinations. The recent announcement of a new variant of New Glenn, called 9x4, will bring New Glenn's payload capacity into super heavy lift territory. This rocket is developed in a more traditional manner, putting in the development time to reach operational launches quicker with a minimal number of failures. As of the time of writing, New Glenn has flown twice and has successfully landed its first stage booster on their second attempt, which is quite impressive. Notably, this article and script were written before New Glenn's third mission, which was a failure. Both companies and both rockets have contracts with NASA to land crews on the lunar surface as part of the Artemis program. SpaceX's approach is to launch a Starship-based depot into low Earth orbit, fill it up with a to-be-determined but quite large number of refueling launches, with most estimates lying between 15 and 25, and then use the depot to refuel a lunar lander variant of Starship, which will proceed to near rectilinear halo orbit, also called NRHO, around the Moon, pick up crew from NASA's Orion spacecraft, land on the Moon, and return to the Orion spacecraft. It is worth noting that some sources say an intermediate refueling in an elliptical orbit may also be required. Blue Origin's approach is somewhat similar, though I would note that this script was written before the updated architecture, relying more on Blue Moon Mark 1 instead of Mark 2 was announced. I will be addressing the architecture as it existed at the time the article was published. Blue Origin intended to launch a space tug known as the Sizzler Transporter into low Earth orbit and fill it up with a to-be-determined number of refueling launches. Their lander, Blue Moon Mark 2, will launch into low Earth orbit, dock with the Sizzler Transporter, refuel, and then proceed to NRHO. More launches will then refuel the transporter in low Earth orbit. The transporter will then proceed to an intermediate orbit and will be refueled yet again, and will then proceed to NRHO to refuel Blue Moon Mark 2. The lander will then pick up crew from Orion before landing on the Moon and then returning the crew to Orion. With the recent announcement of Blue Origin's New Glenn 9x4 variant, and the call from NASA for both parties to submit optimized approaches, which may differ substantially from the architectures I just described, comparing the approaches on even footing to determine which lander is more suitable for the goals of the Artemis program is a wonderful idea for an article, as there are many valid points to be made for and against each approach. Will Lockett, however, despite the title of this article, does not make such a fair comparison. Diving into the article, the first section compares the standard New Glenn configuration to Falcon Heavy, SpaceX's previous generation vehicle. And how this is going to go is every time Will describes a new number, I'm going to try and find out where it came from. The first claim is that the standard variant of New Glenn, also called 7x2, can take 45 tons to low Earth orbit, 13 tons to geosynchronous transfer orbit, and 7 tons to translunar injection, which is accurate for what we know New Glenn is aiming for. However, it is strongly suspected that New Glenn will take some time to work up to this payload capacity, with some reports stating that the current version, overbuilt and conservatively margined to give better odds for the first reusability tests, has a payload capacity of around 25 tons. This is not unusual for early launches of new rocket designs. In fact, Starship is suffering from the same issues, but it should be noted. I'm keeping a bit of a scoreboard in the bottom left. I won't quite mark this down as true but misleading, as these rumors are not confirmed, but let's keep that in the back of our heads. The next claim is that New Glenn 7x2's 13-ton GTO capacity is 5 tons more than Falcon Heavy's GTO payload, or rephrase, that Falcon Heavy's GTO payload is around 8 tons. This is also more or less true in Falcon Heavy's fully reusable configuration. I could not find official numbers, but we do know that Falcon Heavy can do at least 6.4 tons of GTO while landing all 3 boosters, as it did on Flight 2, and cannot do 9.2 tons GTO while landing all but 3 boosters, as on Flight 7 the center core was expended. So 8 tons seems about right. Falcon Heavy is, however, capable of much greater GTO payloads when the center core is expended, though accurate estimates are hard to come by. Notably, while the future of the Lunar Gateway is questionable, Falcon Heavy was scheduled to launch the first 2 modules of Lunar Gateway, which are far heavier than 8 tons, to translunar injection, which is a more difficult orbit than GTO. I cannot, in good faith, give accurate numbers for the fully expendable payload and the 2-booster reuse payload, but I am quite certain it would be more than New Glenn. Nothing is really alarming so far, but I will note that Will decides to use the least impressive numbers for Falcon Heavy and takes New Glenn's 45-ton number at face value. Next up comes the most egregiously incorrect thing in the entire article, and I'll read it verbatim. And 7 tons to translunar injection, TLI, equivalent to payload to the lunar surface. TLI is absolutely not equivalent to a soft landing on the lunar surface, but in order to explain that, we will need some tools. My 2 primary tools to derive payload capacity will be a delta V map and a delta V calculator. For the uninitiated, a delta V map shows how much change in velocity, or delta V, it takes for a spacecraft to reach various orbits. A delta V calculator runs a simple equation that shows how much a spacecraft can change its velocity by given the dry mass of the vehicle, the wet mass of the vehicle, and the efficiency of the vehicle's engines, usually measured as specific impulse, abbreviated to ISP. These tools do not show the whole story, as there are many factors such as non-instantaneous burns, gravity losses, drag losses, residual propellants, boil-off, startup and shutdown losses, efficiency losses from throttling, maneuvering propellant, and inclination changes that these tools simply do not account for. These are not proper tools for anything past the initial planning stages of real missions or for playing Kerbal Space Program, but for our purposes they can provide more or less a best-case simplified estimate of the performance of a spacecraft assuming we are utilizing direct trajectories. Adding up the values on the delta V map starting in low Earth orbit, it takes about 3.12 kilometers per second of delta V to reach translunar injection, marked on the map as moon transfer. From there, it takes about 2.54 kilometers per second to reach the lunar surface, though the exact values will vary greatly based on how aggressive your landing profile is, as a landing on the moon is highly subject to gravity losses. As you can see, Will's assertion that payload to TLI is equivalent to payload to the lunar surface is blatantly false, unless smashing into the lunar surface at 2.5 kilometers per second qualifies as delivery. This should be enough for you to discount anything this man says about spaceflight, but as you can see, the video has only just started. Next up, New Glenn's launch cost is not known to the public yet, but Will says they have been estimated between $55 and $68 million. That seems suspiciously low, given that Falcon 9 retails for $74 million. Let's Google around and see where he got those numbers from. The $55 million number appears to be the total cost of the spacecraft for NASA's Escapade mission, which launched on a New Glenn rocket. Depending on which source you take, NASA paid either $18 or $20 million to launch Escapade on a New Glenn rocket, which was a deeply discounted price for what was supposed to be, at the time of purchase, the first launch of an unproven rocket. The practice of offering the first flights of new rockets at discounted rates to offset the increased risk is fairly common, and this should not be taken as New Glenn's launch price, unless you are also okay with assigning a $0 price tag to rockets such as Falcon Heavy, the first flight of which was offered for free, but the offer was not taken up by anyone. This $20 million is in addition to the $55 million paid for the spacecraft itself. The $68 million launch cost is from an Arianespace estimate from 2020. I have been unable to find the original source for the estimate, though I can find several articles discussing this. But accounting for inflation, that would be somewhat close to $85 million today. The other common cost estimate for New Glenn is $110 million. That comes from a January 2025 Forbes article based off of an ex-Blue Origin employee's testimony. Now, of those numbers, the $55 million Escapade spacecraft cost, which has no relation to the actual launch cost, the $68 million, now $85 million inflation-adjusted external cost estimate, and the $110 million alleged ex-employee leak, which number do you think Will continues to use throughout the article? If you chose the nonsensical $55 million cost, you chose correctly. By now, Will Lockett's pattern of choosing the most convenient numbers to support his claim, regardless of factuality, should be starting to emerge. The next section is about using a Lockheed Martin developed space tug to boost payload to the lunar surface. One mission would launch this tug and another mission would launch the payload. The two would dock together and the tug would push the payload to the moon. This is a concept known as Earth Orbit Rendezvous and has a long history, having been originally planned for early Apollo program concepts, some Soviet moon program concepts, and the cancelled Constellation program. While it has never been executed in practice, it is a well-analyzed and theoretically sound way to get to the moon. However, the next sentence raises some eyebrows. Using this setup, Blue Origin plans to land a 16-ton Blue Moon Mark II on the lunar surface by 2029. While Blue Moon Mark II's dry mass was indeed 16 tons as of 2023, to launch Earth Orbit Rendezvous is not how Blue Origin intends to get to the moon, as I showed earlier. However, the architecture I showed earlier was explicitly for manned missions to the lunar surface, where the lander must then launch back into orbit. Delivery of cargo to the lunar surface allows near rectilinear halo orbit to be bypassed, saving some fuel, and the lander does not have to launch off of the lunar surface, which saves a lot of fuel. So perhaps Will is assuming they would go with a tug option for cargo missions. The next paragraph is among the most egregious in the entire article. I will read it verbatim. If we assume that the tug vessel costs around $20 million, which is a similar cost to other proposed tug missions, that means the standard nuke land costs around $130 million, given that it requires 2 launches and a tug vessel to get 16 tons to the lunar surface, or $8,125 per kilogram to the lunar surface. That is pretty damn cheap. So let's start with the space tug. Will says that other proposed space tug missions cost $20 million. After Googling $20 million space tug for a bit, I have not come up with a conclusive source for where Will got his numbers. The closest I can find is an article from nextbigfuture.com concerning Impulse Space's Helios tug, a medium-sized space tug for which no mass numbers are available, but handily fits inside a 4.5 meter diameter fairing and is designed to take satellites to geostationary orbit when paired with a rocket comparable to Falcon 9. There are no disclosed cost numbers as far as I can find. The article says, if satellite was 5 to 22 tons, and the Helios only changed about $20 million, then your mission to GEO would be cheaper using Falcon 9 and Helios versus Falcon Heavy. This $20 million number appears to be pulled out of thin air by the author, and given that the sentence containing that quote has a spelling error, a grammar error, and multiple bad cost and mass assumptions, I would question its validity. The only other close matches I could find was a company offering to deliver 100 kilograms of fuel for $20 million, another space company with a $25 million backlog, and a 164-page 1972 NASA document that at one point said that a specific space tug might be funded at $20 million in development costs in a year early in development. And this was in 1972 dollars. But sure, maybe a small GTO space tug could cost $20 million. Fortunately, we know exactly which space tug Will is talking about. It is mentioned that Lockheed Martin is developing this tug, and at the time this article was written, Lockheed Martin was developing 2 space tugs. If you really stretch, the first one can be considered to be Draco, a demonstration of a nuclear thermal rocket engine, which was intended to carry no payload and was cancelled shortly after the release of this article, and which has a project cost estimated at $499 million. The space tug Will Lockett is most likely talking about is the Cis Lunar Transporter, which Lockheed Martin is developing in collaboration with Blue Origin. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to see that the cost of a hypothetical, medium-sized, expendable space tug meant to deliver roughly 5-ton satellites to geostationary orbit is not at all going to cost the same as a massive 7-meter diameter vehicle designed with zero boil-off technology, long-duration power systems, and docking hardware designed to deliver dozens of tons to the moon and possibly return for reuse. Unless there is a source for the $20 million number I missed, which is possible, the $20 million figure was a bogus number from another article author's speculation about a much smaller vehicle, and Will is applying it to a much larger vehicle with much more functionality. Next up, Will says that it will take 2 launches to get 16 tons to the lunar surface. This calls back to the 16-ton dry mass of the Blue Moon Mark II, so we know what lander he is talking about. For a one-way trip, the architecture Will describes is likely possible. Launch 1 carries a 16-ton dry moon lander plus 29 tons of fuel to low Earth orbit. Launch 2 carries the space tug. Generously, I will assume that the space tug weighs exactly 0 tons dry and is entirely composed of 45 tons of propellant. Also generously, the specific impulse of Blue Origin's BE-7 engine, which is used to power the Cis Lunar Transporter and the space tug, is unknown, so I will assume 465.5 seconds, which is the specific impulse of the RL-10B2, the highest specific impulse of any hydrogen-oxygen engine currently in service. I will also assume that this engine is massless. Plugging these rather optimistic numbers into the delta-V calculator, the proposed architecture can easily accomplish this to such a margin that the optimistic assumption I made earlier won't really matter. Will then uses everything we've talked about so far to give a cost per kilogram number to the lunar surface. Using cost per kilogram can be problematic sometimes, but that's a separate discussion I will stay out of, as we could be here for 2 hours if I talked about that. On the cost side, Wheel takes the $55 million launch cost for New Glenn, which is a known lowest number, and multiplies it by 2 for 2 launches. He then adds the $20 million space tug cost, which is again a known bogus number, and then assumes the Blue Moon Mark II lander costs precisely $0, which is definitely a bogus number, for a total mission cost of $130 million. He then divides this by the dry mass of the Blue Moon Mark II lander, which is not carrying any payload, to give a cost of $8,125 per kilogram to the lunar surface. This payload figure is useless for a customer, as presumably they paid to have their surface payload launched, and just having an empty lander is not going to be good enough for them. Granted, for a one-way cargo mission, much of Mark II systems can be removed, as Mark II is intended to be a lander that carries humans, so you won't need a pressurized cabin or life support or anything like that. But going back to our simplified calculations from earlier, let's add 16 tons of customer payload to the mix. All of a sudden, this vehicle cannot make it to the moon, which requires at best 5.66 kilometers per second from low Earth orbit. In order to deliver this payload, the full stack must be no more than 26 tons dry, which, minus the payload, is 10 tons. As I mentioned before, Blue Moon Mark II is intended to be a manned lander, so maybe stripping it down to a cargo version without all of the human-related systems could yield a 10-ton dry mass. But again, we are assuming that New Glenn can in fact launch 45 tons, assuming that this lunar transporter weighs 0 kilograms, assuming that the landing profile is very aggressive, and assuming that the entire stack is powered by the most efficient hydro-locked engine ever flown. I feel confident in asserting that Blue Moon Mark II operating in the proposed architecture described by Will Lockett cannot in fact deliver 16 tons of customer payload to the lunar surface in 2 launches, much less for only $130 million. This should probably be enough to get you to never trust anything this guy says ever again, but we are only about a quarter of the way through the article and I'm nowhere near done yet. Speed running through the next 2 paragraphs. Yes, 9x4 is projected to do 70 tons. No, Falcon Heavy cannot also do 70 tons. On paper it can do 63.8 tons, but is in practice limited to a far lower value unless someone pays to develop a stronger payload adapter. Yes, 14 tons of GTO is 75% more than Falcon Heavy, but only if you're counting the configuration in which all 3 cores are reused, and that 20 tons number with the tug likely came from the New Glenn 9x4 announcement, which is for payload for a single launch of translunar injection, which does not involve the space tug, though with our optimistic math it could be possible in the proposed 2-launch architecture. You pulled the $100 million number out of thin air, and no, the tug does not cost $20 million. No, it probably wouldn't cost more per kilogram than the standard variant, you're just not doing the math. Not even doing the math wrong, you're just not doing the math, you're just guessing. But sure, in magical fantasy land, the best number Will Lockett came up with for New Glenn was $8,125 per kilogram to the lunar surface. I am on page 6 of the script, and Will is finally starting to get to his point. How does this compare to Starship? Starship is designed to eventually be capable of carrying 100 tons into low Earth orbit with rapid zero refurbishment reuse. This is an incredibly ambitious goal and would represent the holy grail of rocketry. Due to its ambitiousness, many have chosen to adopt a wait-and-see approach, which is more than understandable given how troubled Starship's development has been thus far. The architecture Will assumes for Starship cargo flights to the moon aligns with the expected architecture minus the depot. A Starship launches to low Earth orbit with the payload, and then is refueled by a large number of ships, and then proceeds through translunar injection and to a landing on the moon, not being reused. This notably differs significantly from the profile proposed for manned missions, which is much more demanding and has a lot of potential for valid discussion, but Will decides to not go there. It is no secret that Starship is currently struggling to hit its payload numbers. This is due to some combination of mass growth during development, excess margins to prove reuse, and performance increases that have not been implemented yet. The official numbers state that the version 1 Starship, now retired, was capable of about 15 tons to orbit. The version 2, also retired, about 35, and version 3, which is currently under construction, is aiming for at least 100 tons. Please note that this article and script were written before version 3 had launched, and on its first mission it took roughly 40 tons to an almost orbital trajectory. All we can do is wait and see if Starship V3 will deliver on those numbers, but Will Lockett initially uses the version 2 numbers, claiming it is generous to do so when the demonstrated payload was only every 16 tons of mass simulators on their nearly orbital test missions. Weird that he is fine with using New Glenn's stated 45-ton payload capacity, given that so far it has only launched a bit over 1 ton at the time of writing, though this was to transmart injection. And weird that he is fine claiming that Falcon Heavy has a 70-ton payload capacity, when it has only demonstrated under 10 tons, but whatever. Will Lockett claims that SpaceX will have to fully refuel Starship in order to get a 35-ton payload to the lunar surface, requiring 1,500 tons of propellant across 42 refueling missions. Now, let's be pessimistic here. Starship's dry mass is a big unknown right now, with various design goals having been given at 80, 85, 100, and 120 tons, but the current value is likely significantly more. Let's call it 150 tons. The cargo lunar landing version would likely be lighter, as it doesn't need a heat shield or flaps, but let's ignore that. Pretty much everyone should be able to agree that the lunar lander variant of Starship is likely to be lighter than 150 tons dry. As far as engine efficiency, the sea-level Raptor engines on Starship are estimated to have a vacuum-specific impulse of between 350 and 355 seconds, and the vacuum Raptor engines are estimated to have a specific impulse of between 365 and 382 seconds. Let's again be pessimistic and assume a flat value of 350 seconds across the entire mission profile. And as far as delta V requirements, let's up that bare minimum 5.66 kilometers per second from low Earth orbit to the lunar surface up to 6 kilometers per second, despite the fact that Starship is more capable of an aggressive landing profile than Blue Moon is due to its higher thrust-to-weight ratio. At 35 tons per refueling, it would only take 26 refueling missions, or 28 total counting the lunar ship and the depot, which we'll neglect to include, and which probably would have been reused in orbit for further missions, so wouldn't cost the same as a normal launch. That is far lower than the 43 launches Will Lockett proposes. Now on to cost. Will Lockett does this annoying thing where he pulls numbers from previous articles, and if you want to debunk everything, you have to go several articles deep. Will Lockett proposes a $70 million launch cost for a fully reusable Starship from a previous article of his, which he calls, quote, very optimistic. I don't have the time to go through every single article of his, but hopefully I've built up enough credibility that you can take me at my word when I say that this number is also worthless. The previous article had actually calculated only $53 million, but the methods were incredibly bad and I wouldn't take this number with a mountain of salt. My view is that SpaceX will not stop iterating on Starship until well after they had a more cost-effective launch system than Falcon 9. Half of its reason for existence is to launch Starlink satellites significantly more cost-effectively than Falcon 9 does. But, giving Will a very much unneeded benefit of the doubt, I will take that $70 million launch cost at face value for the rest of this section. Multiplying his 43 launch number by the $70 million cost, he comes up with a smidge over $3 billion for 35 tons to the lunar surface, which is nearly 8 times worse than the earlier calculated New Glenn number. He also says that it will take 9 years based off of Starship's current flight rate of 5 per year. Sin number 1 is obviously taking the current flight rates during the experimental expendable phase and assuming SpaceX won't improve those launch rates. As you can see by this graph of Falcon 9's launches, they are kind of the king of improving launch rates, though it may take them a while to get going. Sin number 2 is misrepresenting the current cadence. I'll admit that this is a bit of a nitpick, but in calendar year 2025 they launched 5 Starships, but going from what was at the time of writing the most recent launch to a year before that launch, the number is 6, and if you stretch it by one more day, it's 7. Now, I hope you see the problem with this. He is consistently assuming unrealistically magical numbers for Blue Origin's approach, taking future planned numbers as gospel, and is consistently assuming unrealistically abysmal numbers for SpaceX's approach, taking only the currently proven in-development numbers as gospel. And then he compares the two sets of assumptions as if they were equal. This is not by any stretch of the imagination an unbiased comparison of the two approaches. Will then discusses Starship V3, assuming it gets 100 tons of payload and also assuming it requires a full tank to get its payload to the moon, requiring 16 refueling flights, which it doesn't, even with our pessimistic assumptions earlier, it only takes 12. Again, not taking into account the depot, this is 17 launches, and he estimates the total cost at $1.19 billion, or $11,900 per kilogram, which is worse than both of the New Glenn examples. Well, until you factor in that it only takes 12 refuelings and not 16. Even adding back in the depot for a total of 14 launches, that's only $9,800 per kilogram, cheaper than the New Glenn 9x4 example. Also, I want to again point out that Will assumes the entire 16-ton dry mass of Blue Moon Mark II is the only payload, and does not apply the same assumption to Starship's dry mass. I'm like a solid 75% sure he's doing this on purpose. I don't need to tell you how ridiculous this double standard is. With missions with crew on board, the distinction between dry mass and payload can get blurry, but this is specifically for cargo missions. Earlier in the article, Will basically says that, yeah, the cost per kilogram number I picked out of thin air for 9x4 is more than for 7x2, but going from 16 tons to 20 tons enables more complex missions and might be worth it in some cases. Even at the numbers he arrived at, with 100 tons via Starship being 8.2% more expensive per kilogram than the New Glenn 9x4 approach, he never brings up this thought ever again that the premium might be worth it for the missions that can be enabled by going from 20 tons to 100 tons. In fact, he explicitly says it's not worth it for the 35-ton Starship example. He then says it's less convenient, which I don't really get, and then he says that it is far more risky than New Glenn, which is a fair point. I would trust a 2-launch architecture more than a 43 or 17 or 14-launch architecture, all else kept equal. And this is a topic that you can absolutely create a productive, interesting, and nuanced discussion about, but Will barely devotes 2 sentences to this topic. The next paragraph is about boil-off. For the uninitiated, both lunar lander designs utilize cryogenic propellants, which must be kept very cold in order to stay liquid. If they are allowed to warm up, they will gradually boil away into a gas, which is then vented into space, hence the term boil-off. Previous missions to the moon have used propellants which can be stored at much higher temperatures, though these propellants offer less efficiency than cryogenic propellants. Both lunar lander architectures intend to solve this problem in different ways. Blue Origin's approach is to develop zero boil-off systems to cool the propellants down to offset heating. SpaceX's approach is to use insulation and other techniques to reduce the rate of heat transfer to the propellant, and thus the rate of boil-off. There are risks to both approaches, and again, this could be an interesting and nuanced comparison with a lot of numbers, but Will doesn't go there. Will emphasizes the risk that boil-off could increase the number of refueling launches required to refuel the lander, but conveniently never mentions the depot, which is designed to minimize boil-off, though it is still a concern in other phases of flight, given that SpaceX does not intend to employ a zero boil-off architecture on the lander like Blue Origin does. He then says that the boil-off rate could be so much that you couldn't launch fast enough, which, yeah, that could be a problem if you're assuming they're only launching 5 times per year. And then he's all, Blue's architecture doesn't rely on refueling and instead uses proven docking and tug technology. And yeah, for small payloads they don't have to do refueling and can directly launch the Mark 1 lander to TLI with enough propellant to land. For payloads at the scale Will describes, as per the math I did earlier, refueling would likely be required unless they were willing to launch multiple cislunar transporters. And I might add, the cislunar transporter is not proven technology. For the second half of this paragraph, I'm not sure if Will is talking about simultaneous launches or just rapid back-to-back launches, so I'm just going to skip that. Now, I will, however, mention that, having 2 launch pads is great for a variety of reasons.
Hello there, this is Steve from editing here. This section hits so much harder after Blue Origin blew up their only launch pad and they're out of commission for a few months. But obviously I didn't know about that when I was recording this. Back to the video.
I can't find a source for the claim that they would have a second East Coast launch pad, but I can believe that they would pursue it eventually. And actually, as an update from 5 months after the script was written, they are indeed planning a second East Coast launch pad now. Notably absent is the fact that Starship has 5 East Coast launch pads in the works right now. 2 at Starbase, 1 at Launch Complex 39A, and 2 at Space Launch Complex 37, and maybe a 6th, I believe, at Space Launch Complex 49, I think. But I'm going from memory here, and that one might have been canceled. Granted, that's not equal to 43 or however many flights Will thinks it'll take to refuel Starship, but 5 launch pads for a rocket is quite frankly unprecedented. Another note from 5 months after the script was written, I think the plan has changed for some of those East Coast launch pads, and this was before the Louisiana launch site was announced. Though the Louisiana launch site is likely targeting polar launches, overflying the narrow part of Mexico, and should probably not be counted as an East Coast launch pad for the sake of this discussion. The next paragraph is quite frankly egregious. I've been saying that word a lot. He claims that there's a significant explosion risk during orbital refueling. He bases this off of his estimate that even on Earth, where operations are much simpler, there is a whopping 5% chance of a Starship exploding while it is fueled up. Where does he get this number from? I don't know. So I guess I'll have to compile the statistics myself. Will's claim specifically refers to ships exploding during fueling the ship here on Earth, so I will limit my search to full tank-length ship prototypes, excluding Starhopper and the short tank tests, only including the ones that actually had fuel in them at some point, so not counting nitrogen-proof tests. I'm going over this really fast, so there may be some errors. I will count partial tankings on this list, as while transferring a few tons of propellant for static fire is not in the same risk category as a full tanking for launch. Refuelings are only going to transfer a small amount of propellant anyways. Sparing you the several hours of research this took to figure out, a low estimate for the total number of successful tanking events in the Starship program as of the time I am writing the script is at least 84. If I didn't know whether a test was nitrogen or actual propellant, I erred on the side of nitrogen, so the number could feasibly be far higher. There are only 3 events which could extremely charitably be described as fueling-related failures. Starship Serial Number 4 blew up shortly after its 5th static fire test. To my knowledge, we never learned the root cause, but I have heard various explanations. A valve sequencing error, leaky valves, or valves on ground support equipment not closing. The second failure was Starship Serial Number 8, which kicked up debris from the launch pad during a static fire which damaged the vehicle, leading to it being unable to empty its header tank, which blew a burst disc due to the pressure buildup sometime later. The third failure was Ship 36, where a composite overwrapped pressure vessel in Starship nose cone containing gaseous nitrogen for the ship's environmental control system exploded, most probably due to undetected damage. I will point out that I am being incredibly charitable to Will here. The first anomaly is on the very first full-length ship they ever put fuel in, and we are not sure if it was related to this tanking process or just the act of firing the engines, or possibly the ground support equipment. The second anomaly is definitely not related to the tanking process, but did prevent detanking, and was caused by ground debris, which is notably absent in space. The third anomaly was likely unrelated to the propulsion system, assuming my understanding of environmental control system is correct. But even with this low estimate of total tankings and high estimate of total failures, the data shows a 3.5% failure rate, which is far below Will's estimated 5% failure rate. Given no other context, I'm going to assume he just made this number up. Anyway, Will extrapolates this 5% explosion rate over 42 refueling flights and comes up with an 88.5% chance of explosion, or 54% for V3's lower refueling count, which would destroy the lunar-bound Starship. Well, it wouldn't, because they would be using a depot for all except the last refueling, where it would go from the depot to the lunar landing ship. But Will is conveniently ignoring the depot, probably because it solves a lot of the problems he's talking about. To be clear, I am not at all saying that cryogenic refueling is a solved problem. SpaceX's header tank fuel transfer tests they have done on their suborbital flights can only de-risk the actual transfer so much, and the refueling demo has been continually delayed. This is not a problem that has been definitively solved and carries some amount of risk, but Will is making a risk number out of nowhere, making a flight count up out of nowhere, and coming up with a mission failure rate number out of nowhere. This is not an accurate assessment of the risks of orbital cryogenic refueling. The next section of the article just rehashes the garbage numbers from above in slightly different packages and contexts, so I'm going to skip it. The second to last paragraph's main point is schedule, saying in short that Starship is slow and New Glenn is fast. Now, if you have been following Private Space Slate for any length of time, you will probably be at least chuckling at somewhat at this characterization of Blue Origin being fast. Starship is of course behind schedule, like practically every other rocket in history. For a baseline schedule, I will take the schedule published in 2016, where the Interplanetary Transport System, the much larger rocket that would eventually evolve into Starship, was first announced. Starship's initial orbital testing was supposed to conclude by the end of 2022 as of 2016, and will likely run through the end of 2026. At least a 4-year delay. In that time, they have produced dozens of prototypes and have conducted 11 full-scale developmental launches, managing to reuse the first stage booster and managing to land the ship in the ocean 5 times with varying levels of damage from re-entry. At this point, they would have a perfectly workable orbital launch vehicle if they were not focusing on figuring out upper stage reuse before payload delivery. As of 2016, New Glenn, which was then referred to as Very Big Brother, was supposed to launch in 2020 and did not launch until 2025, which, being generous, that was January 2025, so a 4-year delay. In that time, they have launched twice and landed but not reused one first stage. Again, this was written before they had reused the first stage. Since then they have. These are roughly comparable delays. Neither is comically larger than the other. I agree with Will that 9x4 will probably appear before 2030. I, however, do not see any feasible reality where Starship will not be in commercial service by then. Even at the current launch rate, which Will says is 5 per year, that would require them to have 20 additional launches without a customer or internal Starlink orbital payload, which would be quite frankly ridiculous. As far as the technical side of things goes, that does it. Will Lockett does not understand the basic principles of spacecraft performance and consistently uses beyond best case scenario numbers for Blue Origin while consistently using beyond worst case scenario numbers for SpaceX. To demonstrate how comical this is, I will do the reverse. I will use incredibly pessimistic numbers for New Glenn and incredibly optimistic numbers for Starship. Starship, with 382 seconds of specific impulse as listed for the reactor vacuum engine, and an 80-ton dry mass of the stripped-down expendable version, with 200 tons for refueling launch estimated for the V4 Starship, SpaceX would be able to deliver 150 tons to the surface of the moon, as well as its own 80-ton dry mass with 4 refuelings. At $20 million per launch, which is, by the way, 10 times greater than the stupidly optimistic figures people like to throw around, this would be $435 per kilogram to the lunar surface, which is, quite frankly, amazing. On the other hand, Blue Origin can maybe launch a New Glenn 9x4 for $110 million, optimistically. Cis Lunar Transporter and Blue Moon Mark II probably cost at least twice as much each, as they are specialized low production rate vehicles. Blue Moon Mark II is listed as taking 30 tons to the moon in a one-way mission, but I don't believe that, given that Blue Moon Mark I can supposedly do up to 3 tons, and they haven't even flown it with that much payload yet. So, optimistically, Blue Moon Mark II can land 3 tons on the moon. The architecture describes 3 refueling operations, but New Glenn can only launch 25 tons of propellant at a time, according to Eric Berger. So, if we assume each vehicle has a 45-ton propellant capacity, the 2 low Earth orbit refuelings would take 2 launches each, and the intermediate orbit refueling would take more, perhaps 4. Combine that with the launches of the lander and transporter, you would get a whole 10 launches, assuming none of them fail and assuming their zero boil off actually works. That's a total of over $1.5 billion, or $500,000 per kilogram. That is over 1,000 times more expensive than the SpaceX option. And to top it off, at their current launch rate, it would take 8 years for them to conduct all of those launches. That is, of course, complete bullshit. The vast majority of the numbers I just spouted off were either lies, extreme values, cherry picking, or apples to orange comparisons, using most of the same tactics that Will did. If you're curious as to what I believe accurate numbers would be, I don't know. Both systems are still in development. There's any number of factors that could tilt the cost in order of magnitude in each direction. We will just have to wait and see for a few years. The last paragraph, however, and I won't read it out loud, is where everything makes sense. This is not meant to be a good faith comparison between 2 competing lunar lander architectures. This is meant to convince people to dislike Elon Musk. And that is made more clear if we take a look at the rest of Will's articles. Nearly all of them are attacks on Elon Musk's ventures. I cannot speak to the quality of the AI articles and the Tesla articles, as those are not my area of expertise. For all I know, those articles could be perfectly fine. But I have read a number of Will's SpaceX-related articles, and most of them are worse than this one. Now, don't get me wrong, it is absolutely okay to dislike someone. I can think of many reasons someone might dislike Elon Musk. And it's absolutely okay to write opinion pieces about how much you dislike someone that are intended to spread your opinion. But it is not at all ethical or responsible journalism to make up reasons to dislike someone and present them as if they are real. If you're going to dislike someone, please dislike them for things they've actually done, not whatever monstrosities Will Lockett has concocted in his mind. The average person who reads this article knows next to nothing about space, and will come away from it believing that it was a good faith comparison between the SpaceX and Blue Origin approaches of delivering payload to the lunar surface, when, in reality, the article is anything but that. In short, all of Will Lockett's space-related articles that I have read demonstrate a complete and utter lack of basic understanding of even the most rudimentary mechanics of spaceflight, consistently and comically overestimate and misrepresent the performance, in both material and financial terms, of any space project when being compared to SpaceX, consistently and comically understate and misrepresent the performance in both material and financial terms of SpaceX's projects, and obviously does so with the aim of misleading and further polarizing readers with regards to Elon Musk. And before you start accusing me of bias, I have two things to say. Firstly, while I support the overwhelming majority of spaceflight-related ventures, including those of Blue Origin and SpaceX, without going into too much detail, I will point out that I work for a direct competitor to SpaceX, and if anything, I would stand to financially benefit if their reputation diminished. I would like to believe I would never sink that low to attack a competitor for financial gain, but it is worth noting that the incentive is there. Secondly, I have also picked up that I likely fall on the same side of the political aisle as Will does, though my positions are generally more nuanced. So I hope you will believe me when I tell you that I am not calling out Will out of partisanship or tribalism. I am calling him out because he's wrong. In even shorter terms, Will Lockett's articles are trash. Goodbye.